Usually when we talk about a legal judgment, there's this underlying expectation of mechanical precision.
Right, it's supposed to look a lot like engineering.
Exactly. Like someone breaks a rule, and the prosecution presents this clear chain of events.
Yeah, and the judge essentially points at the timeline and says, well, there it is. Action A obviously caused outcome B.
Right. It's a very linear way of viewing the world. Action, reaction. We like things to be visible, to follow a predictable trajectory that we could just sort of categorize into neat little boxes.
We do, but then you take that linear expectation and you force it into the world of internet topology. I mean, complex systems with billions of interacting nodes.
And suddenly that straightforward cause and effect machine is completely broken. We end up looking at a diagnostic landscape that is, frankly, incredibly murky.
Murky might be an understatement, because when 19th century legal philosophy collides with 21st century network physics, you get this profound structural confusion.
Which brings us to today. Welcome to today's deep dive, dated May 22, 2026. Today we are looking at a stack of sources that are genuinely mind-bending.
They really are. We're examining a legal defense document titled The Blood Letter from Prison.
Yeah, written by a scholar named Dr. Chen Jingwan. And our mission today is to explore how Dr. Chen used the hard sciences, specifically like complex network physics, the CIP theorem, and psychological frameworks, to systematically dismantle a legal charge of causing serious disorder of public order.
And the wild part about all this, he did this over a single, solitary social media forward.
A single forward. It is a staggering piece of writing. I mean, he's sitting in a cell facing a highly subjective legal charge, and he decides to fight it using the immutable laws of computer science and mathematics.
It's a completely unique approach to a legal defense.
It really is. But before we get into those mechanics, a quick disclaimer for you listening. The source material today touches on some highly politically sensitive topics regarding state censorship and judicial actions.
Right, so we want to be crystal clear here. Our goal today is not to take a political stance.
Exactly. We aren't endorsing any specific viewpoint. We are simply acting as your guides to impartially unpack the fascinating intersection of legal philosophy, psychology, and complex system science, exactly as it is presented in the provided documents.
The focus here is entirely on the structure of his argument. It's about how he leverages science to challenge a legal narrative.
And I promise you, by the end of this deep dive, you're going to have a massive aha moment about how social media networks actually function mathematically. You'll see exactly why our human intuition about cause and effect is often entirely backward in the digital age. Okay, let's unpack this.
So before we even get to the math of the internet, the sources start by analyzing the human element.
Right, because we need to know why Dr. Chen forwarded the material in the first place and why this system reacted with such severity.
To answer that, the documents delve into the psychology of motivation. The text outlines a fundamental clash between two entirely different psychological frameworks.
Okay, let's break that down.
So, on one side, you have Dr. Chen. His behavior is described in the psychological literature as being driven by intrinsic and epistemic motivation.
Epistemic meaning, like, he's doing it primarily out of a desire to learn.
That's the core of it, yeah. He views himself as an academic explorer. He's seeking out diverse viewpoints, collecting data points, and analyzing anomalies in public discourse.
So his motivation is completely internal. It's curiosity, a drive to understand the world around him.
Exactly. But, of course, he gets arrested for this.
Which really makes me wonder, how does someone with an academic, exploratory mindset not just completely collapse when they are thrown into a prison cell? The shock must be overwhelming.
It would be for most people. But the sources actually note that he employed a specific psychological survival strategy called cognitive reappraisal.
Cognitive reappraisal. How does that work in practice?
Well, it's an emotional regulation strategy. You consciously reframe a situation to alter its emotional impact.
Okay, so instead of internalizing the trauma of imprisonment and breaking down.
Right. Instead of doing that, he reframed his personal suffering as a front row seat to a civilizational fault line. He literally saw himself as creating a historical archive.
Oh, wow. So that cognitive reappraisal is what gave him the psychological armor to write this incredibly dense analytical defense instead of simply giving up.
Exactly. He essentially turned his prison cell into an observation deck.
That is incredible. Okay, so that covers the academic mind. But the sources also analyze the psychology of the bureaucracy, the judicial system that arrested him, and they are operating on a completely different wavelength, right?
Entirely different. The judicial system is described as being driven by extrinsic and security motivation.
So they aren't looking to learn or explore at all.
Not even a little bit. Their mandate is to control and stabilize. The text suggests they operate under something called error management theory.
Wait, error management theory. I think I've heard of that in the evolutionary biology context.
Yeah.
Is that the concept about the rustling bush?
Yes,
Like,
exactly.
early humans hear a bush rustling, and they have to decide if it's just the wind or a tiger.
That is the exact origin of the theory. If you assume it's a tiger and you run away, but it's really just the wind, you've made a false positive error.
Right, you wasted some energy, but you survived.
Exactly. But if you assume it's the wind and it actually is a tiger, that's a false negative. You get eaten. So evolution wires us to prefer false positives.
Okay, so how does that evolutionary quirk apply to a modern judicial bureaucracy?
Well, for a bureaucracy obsessed with systemic stability, a potential threat to public order is the tiger. They vastly prefer a false positive.
Meaning they would rather punish an innocent academic who poses no real threat than risk letting a genuine disruption slip through the cracks.
Precisely. And the text also mentions this dynamic sparked System 1 processing within the institution.
That's a psychology term, right? From Daniel Kahneman's work.
Yes, Daniel Kahneman's dual process theory. System 1 is our brain's fast, automatic, highly emotional, knee-jerk reaction mode.
As opposed to System 2, which is the slow, deliberate mode.
Right. When the bureaucracy perceived a threat to stability, they experienced what the sources call moral outrage, which immediately locked them into that fast, emotional System 1 processing.
So they aren't sitting down and logically analyzing Dr. Chen's academic history or his intent. They are just reacting with institutional panic.
What's fascinating here is that it creates a total cognitive narrowing. The bureaucracy experiences institutional emotional numbing.
So Dr. Chen's nuanced academic intent becomes completely invisible to them.
Exactly, because System 1 processing relies on crude heuristics. It highlights a fundamental psychological mismatch. You have an academic's desire for open exploration colliding head-on with a bureaucracy's mandate for absolute control.
So it's basically like a meteorologist stepping into a hurricane out of pure scientific curiosity, but the local police arrest him for trespassing in a disaster zone. They aren't even speaking the same language.
That analogy captures the disconnect perfectly. The police see a boundary violation. The scientist sees a phenomenon to be measured.
Wow. So you have this bureaucracy reacting purely on emotion, the System 1 panic. But they can't just write, "We panicked" on a legal document.
No, they have to legitimize it.
Right. So they hit him with a heavy charge causing serious disorder of public order. But how does Dr. Chen fight that? Because he doesn't just say, "Oh, no, I didn't." He attacks the very concept of order on the internet.
And this is where the defense brilliantly pivots from psychology to network architecture. To dismantle the charge of causing disorder, Dr. Chen invokes a foundational rule of computer science called the CAP theorem.
The CAP theorem. What exactly does that stand for?
It stands for consistency, availability, and partition tolerance. It was proposed by a computer scientist named Eric Brewer in 2000.
Okay, consistency, availability, partition tolerance.
Right. The theorem states that in any distributed computer system, which includes massive social networks like Twitter or WeChat, you cannot simultaneously guarantee all three of those properties. You are mathematically forced to pick two.
Okay, let's make sure we understand those three options for you listening. Consistency, I assume, means everyone using the network sees the exact same data at the exact same time.
Correct. If I post a photo, consistency means no one else can use the system until every single server on Earth updates to show that photo.
Got it. And availability means the system is always up, always responding to user requests, even if the data isn't perfectly updated everywhere yet.
Exactly.
And partition tolerance.
Partition tolerance means the system keeps functioning even if a communication link breaks. And in the real world, network partitions happen constantly.
Right, like fiber optic cables get cut by construction crews, servers lose power, connections lag.
Because partitions are physically unavoidable, partition tolerance is a non-negotiable requirement. A global system absolutely must have it.
Okay, so if you have to have partition tolerance, that means every distributed system on the planet has to make a hard choice between the remaining two: consistency or availability.
Precisely. And social networks will always choose availability.
Well, yeah, because if you open your social media app and it refuses to load your feed until every server in the world is perfectly synced up, the app would freeze for minutes at a time.
Right, we'd all just delete it.
We want instant loading, even if my timeline looks slightly different from your timeline for a few seconds.
And because of that, social networks inherently sacrifice consistency to maintain that instant availability. Therefore, Dr. Chen argues, a perfectly ordered or universally consistent social network is mathematically impossible by design.
Wow. So chaos, meaning localized disorder, fragmented timelines, data that hasn't synced, is actually a built-in foundational feature of the architecture.
Yes. It is the literal cost of doing business at a global scale. It is not a bug, and it is certainly not caused by a single user.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the judicial system is punishing an individual for the structural physics of a distributed network.
Exactly. They're treating a fundamental property of the software as a criminal act.
That is wild. They are essentially criminalizing the CAP theorem. They're demanding a level of perfect, pristine order that the engineers explicitly engineered out of the system in order to make it work.
It's absurd when you look at the math.
It's like suing a single drop of rain for making the ocean wet. The ocean is wet by definition. The network is asynchronous and chaotic by definition.
That's a great way to visualize it. You can't separate the water from the wetness, and you can't separate a social network from its localized disorder.
Okay, but let me push back a bit here, because I think a lot of people listening might have this exact thought. The network is naturally chaotic, sure, but a raindrop does add something to the ocean, right?
Okay, I see where you're going.
Even in a chaotic system, an individual user must have some level of impact. To answer this, the source material zooms in on Dr. Chen's exact location within this vast web.
Yeah, the defense goes highly specific about topology here. Dr. Chen introduces the concept of scale-free networks to explain why his specific position rendered him powerless.
How does a scale-free network differ from what we normally think of? Because most things we encounter in daily life follow a normal distribution, right?
Yeah.
Like a bell curve.
Right, exactly. Most people are average height, with a few very tall or very short outliers. But the internet does not look like a bell curve. It is governed by a power law distribution, creating a scale-free network.
So what does that look like in practice?
In this architecture, you don't have a massive middle class of average users. Instead, you have a microscopic number of massive hubs.
Like celebrities, major news outlets, steep media accounts with millions of connections.
Yes. And then you have a practically infinite number of edge nodes or peripheral nodes. These are normal users with just a handful of connections.
Yeah, and the sources state Dr. Chen was the ultimate edge node. He had fewer than 100 followers and almost zero engagement on his previous posts.
Which is key. And this is where Dr. Chen brings in a concept called Cohen's critical threshold formula, which mathematically models network robustness.
What does that formula actually tell us about the network mechanics?
It proves why scale-free networks are extremely robust against random failures or activities at the edges.
Okay, so if you remove nodes...
Right. If you were to randomly remove nodes from a scale-free network 99.9% of the time, you are hitting an edge node because they make up the vast majority of the network.
And removing them does what?
Removing them or having them act up does virtually nothing to the overall flow of information because the massive hubs are still intact, bridging the network together.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because my immediate thought is, wait, what about the butterfly effect?
Right.
We've all heard the theory that a butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil can cause a tornado in Texas. Even if Dr. Chen is a tiny edge node, couldn't his single forward hit the exact right algorithm, catch a digital breeze, and go totally viral, causing this supposed serious disorder?
It's the intuitive question to ask, but the mechanics of network science explain why the butterfly effect doesn't apply here at all.
It doesn't.
No. The butterfly effect describes very specific nonlinear systems that are highly sensitive to initial conditions. But as Cohen's formula proves, scale-free networks are incredibly robust. They are not fragile at the edges.
So a weak signal from a tiny node dies out.
Because the network is so vast and saturated with information, weak signals from edge nodes are rapidly absorbed and dampened by the sheer volume of background noise.
Wow, so the system acts as a massive structural shock absorber.
Exactly. For a butterfly to cause a tornado in this specific architecture, it would need massive structural leverage to begin with. It would have to be a hub node.
An edge node simply doesn't have the gravitational pull to initiate a system-wide phase transition.
None at all. But Dr. Chen didn't just rely on general network topology to make this point.
Right, he wanted to definitively prove that the butterfly effect didn't happen in his specific case. So he calculated the actual physics of virality using something called avalanche dynamics.
Yes, he moves from the structure of the network to the actual mathematics of information cascades. The defense references the Galton-Watson branching process.
Branching process. Is that similar to how epidemiologists track the spread of a virus? like R naught, the basic reproduction number.
It is the exact same mathematical principle. In epidemiology, if a virus has an R0 of 2, one sick person infects 2 others who infect 4, and it cascades.
Right, exponential growth.
Information virality works the exact same way. For a piece of information to go viral to create an avalanche, the mean offspring number, that R0 must be greater than 1. That puts the system in a supercritical state.
And the documents show Dr. Chen calculated his specific R0 based on his follower count and engagement history. What was his number?
His R0 was calculated at approximately 0.05.
0.005. That is staggeringly low.
It places his action in what physicists call a deep subcritical regime.
What are the actual mechanics of a subcritical regime? Like, what does an R0 of 0.05 mean in the real world when he hits the forward button?
Well, according to the mathematical model of the branching process, an R0 that low means the information cascade will go extinct with a probability of practically 100%.
It just dies.
Yeah, the expected total cascade size, meaning the total number of times it would be shared down the line, is roughly 1.05 forwards.
So mechanically, he hits forward, it goes to his tiny network, and statistically, it barely travels a fraction of a step further before dying out completely. It just stops.
Now, contrast that mathematical reality with the legal reality he was facing. The judicial standard applied in this context for a serious offense requires an impact of 500 forward or 5,000 views.
The law demands an impact of 500, and his mathematical physical impact was 1.05.
Yes.
He is roughly 500 times smaller than the absolute minimum threshold required to cause this supposed disorder.
This raises an important question, and it's perhaps the most profound point Dr. Chen makes regarding self-organized criticality, or SOC.
Okay, explain SOC for us. What does that mean if an avalanche were to happen?
Let's say, hypothetically, a massive disruption does occur from an R0 of 0.05.
Okay, the spark somehow catches.
Right. Self-organized criticality theory dictates that if a massive system is triggered by a tiny subcritical perturbation, a spark landing on dry tinder, and it catches fire, it is because the system itself was already deeply unstable. It was in a critical state.
Meaning the environment was primed to explode, regardless of who provided the spark.
Exactly. If a system is so incredibly fragile that a user with an R0 of 0.05 can break it, the fault does not lie with the single edge node.
It lies with the architects.
Yes. The massive hubs and the authorities who allowed the overall environment to reach such a dangerous, unstable state of criticality in the first place, they are mistaking the tiny trigger for the underlying structural cause.
So what did this all mean? We started this deep dive looking at a scholar sitting in a prison cell, facing a completely subjective, emotionally driven legal charge. And we've seen how he built an impenetrable fortress out of hard science.
Step by step.
Yeah. He used motivation psychology and System 1 processing to expose the bureaucracy's panic. He used the CAP theorem to prove that order is mathematically impossible on the internet.
He used scale-free network topology to prove he was a structurally powerless edge node.
And he used the mathematics of subcritical avalanches to definitively prove his expected impact was 500 times smaller than a crime.
It is a masterclass in cross-disciplinary defense. What it ultimately exposes is a massive gaping void between mechanical 19th century legal logic, the idea that A simply and cleanly causes B, and the highly complex nonlinear realities of 21st century digital networks.
You simply cannot govern a complex system using linear tools.
You really can't.
For you listening, I think the real value of this deep dive is a profound shift in perspective. The next time you feel completely overwhelmed by the chaos of your social media feed, or you worry about your digital footprint, remember the physical mechanics of the space you're in.
The network sacrifices consistency for availability. It is chaotic by design.
And your individual retweets, your likes, your posts, unless you are a massive hub with millions of followers, are absorbed by the network. You are an edge node. And structurally speaking, your signals are just harmless background noise in a deeply robust system.
It is a humbling but oddly comforting reminder. We tend to overestimate our individual impact on these massive architectures while simultaneously underestimating the structural forces that actually govern how they behave.
I want to leave you with a final, slightly provocative thought to ponder on your own. Dr. Chen proved that our legal systems are currently failing to understand the most basic physics of network science. They're actively judging human individuals for systemic chaos they didn't create and couldn't possibly control.
Right.
So if the courts are struggling this much with a human being whose R0 is 0.05, how on earth are these same legal frameworks going to handle the assignment of guilt when autonomous AI agents start generating their own unpredictable, highly supercritical cascades across these networks.
That is the horizon we are rapidly approaching. If a legal system panics over a subcritical human, a supercritical algorithmic swarm is going to break the legal paradigm entirely.
We are going to need entirely new diagnostic tools for the digital age, and Dr. Chen's blood letter might just be the blueprint. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. See you next time.